Well, in this second presentation on thinking like an economist, we're going to develop and evaluate our earlier theory. Up to now, we've had a linear version of this theory, shown by this straight red line here, that has a constant slope. But this suggests that the extra exam marks gained from each hour of study is exactly the same. And we postulated this wasn't particularly realistic. So we're going to modify this theory. Here's another variant of it. We're assuming, in this case, that the slope is still positive, but it's curvilinear, it's nonlinear. What are the implications of this? Well, as before, what we'd have to do is look at the intercept term and at the slope. Well, you can see that the intercept doesn't change, which still suggests that zero amount of study will yield a certain minimum percentage on the exam, just like before, but the slope is slightly different. In this case, if you look at the first 4 hours of study, it yields an extra 40%. However, another 4 hours of study gives only 10%. So this suggests that the slope is positive, but it falls. Let's take a closer look at that. So the slope at 2 hours is shown by the slope of that tangent to the curve, which is quite steep in this case. But moving to 6 hours, it gets flatter, and then up to 10 hours, flatter still even flatter. And so this is suggesting that although there's an increase in exam scores brought about by more study, there are diminishing returns to that. So how would we explain this? In other words, how would we explain the positive yet diminishing nature of the slope as study rises? Well, there are lots of possibilities, but it's quite clear that some emerge pretty quickly. For instance, it's likely that some topics are easy to learn, but others take longer because they're more difficult. Is it possible as well that extra study brings on fatigue, both mental and physical? And so as you study longer, so you absorb less. But as we all know as well, as you study for longer hours, the alternatives to that study become more attractive, and so you don't concentrate as much. And there may be other reasons why we would expect this curvilinear relationship. So we've used the graph to help us focus in on elements of the theory which may not have been that obvious before we started. Now remember that in all these considerations, we assume that the ceteris paribus conditions apply, and the theory makes us focus purely upon the relationship between the number of hours of study and final exam marks. What would happen if the ceteris paribus conditions were relaxed? For instance, what would happen if the exam was easier the next time round as compared to this time? Well, this would shift the curve. Any change in the ceteris paribus conditions would shift the curve upward in this particular case when the exam is easier, but possibly downwards if it were more difficult. So, for instance, the implications of that are that this is the last time we had the exam when it was relatively more difficult, and making it easier means that students who were, say, after 4 hours gaining 60% are now able to gain 70% because the exam is easier. And the same applies at the higher levels of study as well. So changes in the ceteris paribus conditions will shift the curve up and down. What about changing the slope? Well, this relates, of course, to the efficiency of any 1 hour of study. So, for instance, let's say that this class is relatively well taught, whereas this one on the bottom line, it was poorly taught. Why would you expect a change in the marks for that associated with that level of study? Well, the ceteris paribus conditions have not altered this distance, but they've altered the efficiency of learning. So, for instance, a poor teacher may give his or her class, poor referencing, or may explain things poorly and put students on the wrong track, so that when they read in the textbook the same points in the textbook, they start questioning it, and they're unsure because they believe the teacher, but the teacher is actually not particularly good. So they end up with lower exam scores as a consequence for the same number of hours of teaching.